Okay, so what we're going to review today is kind of what grief is. Like I said just before, is that death is a huge part of grief and loss, and I think that's what we mainly think of, but it's a lot more than just that. So why is this so important in our work? What are the different types of grief that are going to maybe be presented to you that we might not initially think of as grief and loss? And then the different types of losses that impact these different types of grief. And then we're going to go over some symptoms of grief and loss as well. And I think that one of the biggest things I've seen, so I actually do a 3.5-hour workshop every Wednesday with the women here. And like Lorraine said, it's a trauma-focused house. And when they see it on the schedule, they're like, but I don't know anyone who's died, or I don't really have any grief. And I'm like, okay, well, what have you experienced trauma? Have you experienced maybe a really toxic breakup or relationship? And they're like, well, yeah, it's trauma-focused house. That's why I'm here. I'm like, okay, so come in. I'm going to show you, exactly how this is tied in to mental health and what you're dealing with on a daily basis. And so it's really cool to see that kind of switch and realize that they're actually grieving a lot more than they realize. So grief is our internal reaction to the loss we've experienced. So the loss happens and then we feel that grief. So grief is really on the inside and it's multifaceted. It can look really different to different people and across different people. And it's not in that kind of cycle or stage that we were classically taught. And I'll go over that at the end. So it looks really different and it can kind of be all over the place. And I thought this was really interesting because you ask people, what does grief mean? That's something I always ask in the beginning of my workshop on Wednesdays with these women. Is what does grief mean to you? And people are like, oh, a loss, or it's sad. And so I wanted to add it in here that grief is rooted from the Anglo-French word meaning gref, and it's an injustice or heaviness. And I think that really nicely sums up kind of what grievers are walking around with. It's really heavy. Obviously, there's a lot of other emotions attached to it and feelings, but this heaviness that they're carrying day to day. And sometimes for years. And so we're going to go over some of the different types. But first, I want to address, why is this important? So why should you be looking for this in your sessions with your clients? So it manifests in many different ways in our work. And I think if we miss this grief piece, right, we're missing an essential part of the client's experience. So being able to see, okay, so maybe this isn't a death-related loss, maybe this is a trauma-related loss, and okay, I also now need to do some grief work with my client, along with the other types of therapy that we incorporate. Like I said before, grief and loss are relative to each person. It looks really different, and one person's loss and grief may not necessarily be another person's. When I was working over with Debbie, we would get so many phone calls for pet loss. And as a new AMFT, I was like, pet loss, like, that's not, really grief. And then as I was taught, what grief is and how it presents and how it's different for each person, I really understood, oh my gosh, sometimes something as little as pet loss, I mean, maybe that was the only connection they ever had, right? And they just lost it. Maybe they grew up in a home where there was abuse, there was no support, and suddenly they have this animal, and that was the only positive experience they had. And so realizing to that person that that's a huge loss, and now they're grieving a relationship. And I'll go over in the next couple slides kind of how that fits in and how that isn't necessarily validated by a lot of people and the impact that can have on our clients. And so by not addressing or identifying grief and loss, what's happening is we're really missing this essential part of the client's experience in our work. How can we help them? Well, if we're only addressing trauma with EMDR, well, hold on, what about this entire grieving experience that may be happening, right? And so really being able to look at and say, okay, there's more than just this modality to address with our client. And then one thing that I'll also be kind of talking about throughout this presentation, and what I've really loved about working at La Ventana is grief, loss, and trauma are so connected. That I've really fallen in love with that work, and it has helped me so much in my trauma work. When I was a new AMFT, I was really intimidated by trauma. I was like, what do I do with trauma? And then I just realized, oh my gosh, so much of my trauma work has to do with grieving losses and helping our clients reconcile that. And it's been really amazing work. So what are the different types of grief? Different types of grief come from different types of losses, which will be in the next slide. You have your traditional kind of validated grief, death of a loved one, a divorce, somebody who's been struck by natural disaster, right? Kind of these events that are more socially acceptable, or people kind of in the wider society like to say like, oh yeah, that's a reason to grieve, or I get why you're having a hard time. So I don't want to say that's easy, it's not easy, but it's a little bit more cut and dry when we're doing our work, or it's a little bit easier to acknowledge and identify. What I really love about this grief work and how I've applied it here at La Ventana is what's been coined, and this is something that my mentor really helped me sort through and understand, is this hidden and disenfranchised grief. And it's the grief that really isn't being acknowledged or valid to grieve. So these losses aren't recognized by a wider society, or maybe they're not recognized by family and friends. It's any grief that goes unacknowledged, cannot be publicly mourned, or is invalidated and unheard, right? So when we see that piece, it's, okay, so I can't talk about my grief, right? Which then it becomes more isolating. It's more difficult to work through. So now I'm stuffing, maybe I'm coping in unhealthy ways. And the last bullet point there says it's often, there's often a lack of support from the community or family and friends. And, as I'm doing my work with my clients, what I'm seeing is they're constantly saying, well, I didn't even realize I was valid in this, or I didn't even realize that this was grief and I could grieve this, or that I was grieving. What do I do with this? And so it's really amazing to kind of help them make that connection and really validate what has never been validated for them. And just a few examples. Like I said, we're going to go into the losses and what that looks like. But I brought up the pet loss. You can't really go into work 3 months later and say, I'm still really upset because my dog died. People are going to look at you and be like, okay, that's sad, but there's not this deeper understanding of how it will affect each person. There was a woman I worked with, and her colleague actually ran a support group for the other woman. Because again, it's one of those, so the other woman, mistress, whatever you would like to call them, lost their lover. And again, the wider society, right, doesn't want to acknowledge that is important, because typically that's not accepted, right? So it's like, well, you were doing something wrong, or you don't have the right to grieve this. Well, that doesn't really matter, because she or he is grieving. They lost a person that they had a really deep bond with. And so while it was death related, or maybe a separation, their pain isn't seen and it's not helped. And so this really, really perpetuates that complicated grief. One type of grief I really want to hit on is anticipatory grief, for a few reasons. One is, it's currently happening to us right now, I think, in this pandemic, and I'll explain why. And it's kind of complicated. So it's grieving losses that are currently happening, while also grieving past losses and what will no longer be in the future, right? So if we think about the death of a loved one, not only are we grieving that person who's gone, we're grieving what will no longer be, while also grieving what we just lost. This can also happen while we're taking care of a sick partner, maybe going through a divorce or a crumbling relationship, right? Kind of watching things unfold, grieving what's in the moment, fearful of what's to come, longing for maybe what was. And it's really, really difficult. And so it's a little bit more complicated than the typical grief. And then the pandemic piece. So we're living in a time now where our social relationships are not what they were. There have been lives and jobs lost, right? So that financial identity piece sometimes has been taken away. We don't know what's going to come, right? We don't know what's going to happen in the future. So there's all of these grieving processes that I don't really think that we're given permission to grieve. And I don't really think that people are taking into consideration how much this has impacted us. And we're grieving what used to be, right? We can't just go to a coffee shop and meet a friend or have a big dinner to celebrate something, or we can't get together to mourn, right? Those funerals that we would once have, those celebrations of life are very different now. And that's an essential part of grieving, is having a community and having support. So that anticipatory grief, I think, is really important, and is kind of sneaky, because someone comes in and you're like, oh my gosh, okay, there's a lot of pieces going on with this. So disenfranchised and hidden grief come from losses. So what is a loss? And I think when loss is defined, and I'll read it in a second, but when loss is defined in this way, we can really see how grieving can take place for so many different reasons. So loss can really be anything. It's defined as a change or an end in a relationship, or a change and an end in a familiar pattern of behavior. So when we see loss in this way, we're like, wow, okay, grief can come with many faces. And people talk about big T, little t, right? Okay, well, maybe there's bigger losses and little losses, and this kind of variation of grieving that is happening with our clients. And again, I think this goes back to, some people don't even realize that they're valid in this, or that's what's happening. A lot of dismissal. I see a lot of that from our clients with, well, I don't know, am I deserving of this? It shouldn't really be that big of a deal. And reminding them, well, it doesn't matter, right? What's a big deal to you? So hidden losses. This is obviously not the entire list, but I think this is a lot of what people don't want to talk about, or have a really difficult time talking about. Losses that people try to keep quiet. Again, there's kind of things, unfortunately, in the world that we live in, where people see certain losses as more valid than others, or more socially appropriate to talk about. So things like suicide loss. There was a school that one of my clients worked at or attended, and one of her friends committed suicide, and they refused to acknowledge it. They wouldn't talk about the circumstance of the death. And that was really difficult for her. And she really needed that support to understand what was going on. So while there was that, yes, I lost my friend and I'm grieving that, there was this other piece of suicide that is really complicated, and especially for a young person. Drug overdose, people don't want to talk about that, right? You lose someone says, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. How did you lose your mother, grandpa, father, brother, sister? There might be shame in saying it was a drug overdose. Or maybe there's fear of judgment. I hear a lot of that, fear of judgment. Well, I can't really talk about what the details of the loss. Homicide loss. I've had several clients that I worked with here at La Ventana who had gang-related activity, gang-related deaths. And it took them a couple groups to even say that, because they had said, well, if I tell them how they died, if I tell them, what happened in their death, this gang-related activity, I'm going to be judged. They're going to be judged. And I don't want that for them. I had a client even tell me one time that she had a cousin who was killed in gang-related activity, and somebody said that he deserved it. Well, that's what he gets for being associated with that, and it completely dismissed her experience and her pain. So being able, having our clients, giving our clients a permission to say, regardless of the circumstances, right, this is valid and this is difficult and you deserve healing. Historical unresolved grief and trauma. We're seeing this so presently right now with our Black community, our Native American community, trauma that has been unresolved and passed down that isn't acknowledged by the wider community. And needing that, hey, bigger society, we need you to acknowledge that there is trauma that we're dealing with that has been passed down from generation that affects us in ways that you don't understand. But that's not always the case. And so they might show up in our office, and it's a different kind of grief work. It's a different kind of loss that we may not be so familiar with or so obvious. Losses in the LGBTQ community, right? Just that same principle of, is this bigger society of ours accepting of that, or are they minimizing that loss because it doesn't follow certain norms? Infertility, miscarriage, abortion, and pregnancy loss. This is huge. We have several clients right now that we're doing work in this area with, and it's especially with that abortion piece of, I don't feel the right to grieve. It was my choice. And also feeling that they can't talk about it because they will be judged or shamed. And so really validating that, and then just opening up the floor to say, hey, you can talk about that here. You don't have to hide that. And regardless if it was a choice you had to make, it's still heartbreaking. And there's still so much grieving, right? And then even with infertility and miscarriage, people don't really, oh, well, you'll have another baby. Oh, it wasn't meant to be. These super dismissive ways of trying to make people feel better. And so people hide it, right? It's shameful. We don't know. I don't know if I'm going to be supported in this. Getting clean in the loss of a drug. Talk a lot about this as well with our clients. And it's that the previous definition of loss is a change in behavior, right? Or a change in a pattern, or loss of a relationship. And so for some people, that drug was their only coping skill. And while they know it's a good, healthy choice, it's still a loss. They're still trying to deal with this new behavior, this new lifestyle. And then additionally, obviously, we know that with that drug use, there's lifestyle changes that come. There's friendships that were a part of it, regardless of whether it was healthy or not. You're still saying goodbye, and there's still that change, and it can be really difficult. And so what I hear is, well, everyone's just telling me that I shouldn't be upset because this is what's good for me. And that's just not the case. I mean, it is good for them, but it's not the case that it isn't difficult. Relationships that the client chose to end, I just added that in there because it's something that I have heard consistently for about the last month and a half from my women here that I work with, whether it's divorce or a breakup. People are like, well, there's plenty of fish in the sea, or he was a jerk, or she was awful. So you really shouldn't be upset. And it kind of goes back to that anticipatory grief of, well, regardless of whether it was a good choice or not, I'm grieving what's happening now, longing for what was, and really fearful of what's going to be in the future. And so really helping them make sense of that and sort that out. And then lastly, mental health related losses, right? Am I able to attach like I did? Do I have consequences from work, my relationships with kids, partners, friends, and my own feeling of kind of peace, right? Has that been taken? Am I mourning that? Am I grieving those losses? And so losses continued, losses that may not be as hidden, but also just not as recognized, right? So loss of health, chronic pain, illness, loss of relationships, whether it's in death or separation, loss of safety. And this is that big trauma piece that I see. So loss of trust, freedom, independence, justice. With my trauma survivors, I'm constantly seeing this of, well, no, I have trauma, I don't have grief. And it's like, well, tell me what you've lost from your trauma. I'm like, well, what do you mean? Like, well, let's explore that, right? And we hear, well, I don't trust people. I don't trust myself. I don't feel safe anywhere I go, right? I lost my childhood. I lost my innocence, right? Depending on when this trauma happened or who the trauma was with. And this is also really difficult. I missed this piece. I'm going to just rewind for a second. With death-related losses, where we see a lot of complications too, and this is kind of part of that trauma piece, if the person who died was an abuser, there can be a lot of complication there. So it's mourning the death, right? Grieving the person I lost, but then also trying to work through my trauma and grieving the losses from my trauma. And so helping them really sort out and manage all of that grief from this single event. And so that comes up a lot too with my clients here. Loss of identity. This can be related to so many different things. Professional identity, relational identity, physical identity. Was there an accident? Right? Loss of limb, loss of use of your body. That's a big deal. Gender identity, financial identity. There's all of these different pieces that we may not see as grieving when somebody comes in. And then loss of independence. And I did put this in with loss of safety, but this can also be with our elderly community. Are they having to get more assistance? Are they unable to drive? Are they having to go into a nursing home, right? I mean, that's a huge loss and it's a huge transition and it can be really, really difficult for our clients. And so helping them process that and grieve what no longer is. So I'm going to go over some symptoms of grief. I have a couple more slides and then we'll talk about one of the ways that I help my clients kind of make sense of their grief. So cognitively, and so what I love about this is, and I love to see this aha moment with my clients is when I go over this with them in group, is so many of these symptoms, cognitive, emotional, physical, spiritual, and social, are so closely related, or if not the same symptoms of depression, anxiety, PTSD. And so
I never even did that.
And so, there's all of these different symptoms that mimic or the same as or part of the other mental health pieces. So cognitively, there's shock, numbness, difficulty concentrating, difficulty finding the right words, right? So hard when we're grieving, whether it's a loss of a loved one or job, divorce, trauma. How do I articulate myself? How do I express this? Poor memory, easily distracted. Emotionally, there's a lot of fear and anxiety, right? And this could relate to any type of loss. Loneliness, abandonment, yearning, vulnerability, feeling of unsafety, helplessness, powerlessness, anger, irritability, relieved, guilty, numb, and sad. I want to go back to the relieved piece. So many times people will say, well, my abuser just passed, or I was a caretaker for my loved one, and there's a sense of relief. I'm a bad person. And so it's like, well, no, hold on. Let's talk about that relief. And that's actually a really normal response to a loss. Maybe you're relieved that your loved one isn't suffering anymore. Maybe you're relieved that you are now safe because your abuser's gone. So really normalizing and validating that emotion and grief. Physically, you'll see there's a lot of physical symptoms. Grievers, we hold it, right? They hold it in their body, just as we see with trauma and depression and anxiety. There's exhaustion, sleeping issues, headaches, gastrointestinal upsets, autoimmune illnesses, shortness of breath, easily startled, chest pain. So you can see how that really relates to depression, anxiety, and the PTSD. Particularly with my trauma survivors, when they see this, they're like, oh, that's my trauma response. And I'm like, yeah, it is, right? Those are related. That's not a coincidence. And so helping them kind of piece that together is really great and provides a sense of relief. Like, now I understand what's happening to my body, right? And that can be really helpful for them. And then spiritually, for some people, there's a connection, right? They find meaning and comfort in a spiritual or religious sense. And some people don't. Some people find a spiritual distress of, I don't have meaning, connection, or purpose in life. And that can be really difficult for human beings in general, regardless of, what your religious or spiritual affiliation is. And then socially, there's a big, big impact socially. We're hypersensitive. You can be more snappy. You have a low frustration tolerance, maybe having reactions that are over the top, feeling withdrawn or isolated. When I work with the women here, I often say that, it's like our body's covered in a big bruise and everything and everyone is just poking it. And so we kind of get really sensitive or irritated. So there's so many symptoms of grief. And I think recognizing that and validating that for our clients is huge, so that they're like, okay, this is part of it. I'm going through it, rather than there's something wrong with me. And kind of giving them the hope that as you heal, these are going to kind of lessen as well. And then obviously with work too, right? Like all of these are going to affect your work performance, and that can be really scary for a lot of our grievers. So one of the ways, well, I'll go through this first and then I'll talk about one of the ways that I address it is, I really like to say goodbye to the stages of grief. I don't believe in them. When I was working with Debbie Frankel, this was a huge aha moment for me, because I didn't get grief work. I was like, well, this doesn't make sense, because they're not bargaining, they're not angry, they're not in despair. Like, I didn't really get that. It didn't make sense. It didn't fit. So when I was learning and working with Debbie at her practice, I realized, okay, so this is not stages, these are feelings. So grief has many feelings. Depression and anger are feelings, not stages. Denial is more of a feeling of shock, disbelief, or a feeling of being kind of in the surreal way. Bargaining, you can't bargain a loss to reverse. You can't bargain something to be undone. It just isn't how it works. And acceptance is more working through your grief, right, than saying I'm okay with this. And so these are feelings, not stages, and these feelings come and go, or sometimes they're happening at the same time or at different times, right? They don't happen in these separate little boxes. And in no way are they linear in the healing process of our clients. And I think that's another big relief for the women I work with when I tell them, hey, some days you're going to be really depressed and really angry, and other days you're going to feel like you're making so much progress, and then next week you're going to be really angry again. And all of that is okay. And so for me, that was really big. And I think what I see with my clients when we talk about this is they almost have this sense of relief of like, oh, okay, so I'm not doing it wrong. I'm like, well, no, there's no right or wrong way to grieve. And so how to make sense of that grief, a lot of times what we do is writing and acknowledging and being able to say exactly how the event affected you, what came up from that event, the emotions, and then actively practicing not letting it have power over you. It's a 3-part kind of letter, if you will, that I do, that I was taught when I was working at the Grief Center. And it's really, really cool to watch them sort through maybe different parts of gratitude, different parts of regret and shame, and then being able to validate themselves and kind of advocate for themselves. And it looks really different, right? If we're doing a death-related loss versus a non-death-related loss, those processes are going to be really different. It's really awesome to see. And so just to wrap it up, a special thank you to Debbie Jenkins Frankel and La Ventana. So when I was talking earlier, this is my mentor who I worked under, who taught me so much of what I know about grief and loss. She's been doing this for over 25 years. She does private practice grief, and she does trainings, and is just incredible. And I'm so thankful for her. And she's a great clinician and just all around great person. She's done trainings at La Ventana too, which are incredible. And then thank you to La Ventana for letting me kind of take the wheel with my workshops and being able to kind of hone in my way of doing grief and loss, and really specializing in this non-death related piece for our clients. Yeah, and that's all I have. Thank you guys.